All right. Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about money and freedom as they relate to LCFF. Just a quick roadmap. I'll go over just some of the aspects of LCFF. Everybody is familiar with this policy in this room, so we don't need to belabor it. But there are some aspects of it that are relevant for this research. I'm going to go over the research design, hopefully in a very palatable way. And then we'll talk about the results, and I look forward to a more robust discussion afterward. Okay, so it's a massive amount of money over 8 years, $18 billion. And I think one thing you want to note about LCFF, and I think Julie touched on this, it's not, as some school finance reforms have been across the country in the past, aimed at equalizing across district property wealth. This is really supposed to be targeted to students. Okay, and it's easiest to see this in the funding schedule. If you have no disadvantaged kids in your district, you get a per pupil base grant. That amount goes up for each disadvantaged kid in your district until you hit a certain threshold of disadvantage, 55%, and then you get significantly more per pupil. Okay, so this is a redistribution supposed to be toward disadvantaged students. It was also a significant increase in the discretion that districts have over how to spend that revenue, both mechanically, because LCFF money is called unrestricted. It's not really complete freedom, right? There are LCAPs, there are other ways that we want to put guide rails on how districts spend the money. But then there's also this reduction in some remaining categorical programs. Some people have read the LCFF literature and assume there's this massive reduction in categorical programs. That actually, most of that happened in 2009 through a policy called CATFlex, but there was some reduction in categorical restrictions with the LCFF. Okay, so research design. So this is usually the time in the talk where you're going to check your Facebook or maybe catch up on your sleep, but just like hang with me through these slides because I think it's important. There are a lot of people who are analyzing the impacts of LCFF, and research design matters for what they find. Okay, so we want to compare we want to isolate here the revenue impact. What is the impact on students of getting $1,000 extra per pupil? Okay, on grad rates and test scores. So first thing we do is control for schools and districts, right? So Berkeley High and Skyline High in Oakland are different in ways that we can both measure and that we can maybe not measure, but we're just going to control for all of those stable characteristics, ways maybe Berkeley High is better at getting high performing principals, maybe Skyline High is better at parent engagement, and so we don't actually need to know all of those things. We just control for those stable differences. Likewise, we control for year, right? So we go back, the finance data goes back to 2003, 2004, and so each year is different in ways both that we can measure and not measure. 2007 is different than 2015, right? The California economy has continued to improve in the LCFF era, and maybe that rising tide of the economy would have lifted grad rates anyway. Okay, so we want to control for that sort of background secular increase, potential increase in test scores and grad rates, okay? Then the other thing we need to worry about is maybe this rising tide of the economy is going to lift different boats differently. Maybe Berkeley High, for instance, their performance is more tied to the California economy than Skyline High in Oakland. Now, these are just two illustrative high schools, right? We're really doing this for every school and district in California. So what we want to do is control for the pre-LCFF relationship between each school and district and the California economy. So it sort of gives us a counterfactual accounting. What would happen if present trends had continued and LCFF wasn't differentially giving this money to high needs districts? Okay, so that's a lot to absorb, but I'm going to show you a graph that I hope sort of makes plain what we're doing here. Okay, and we're going to control for the proportion of funding subject to restrictions to account for that change as well. Okay, so let's see, nobody can see that laser pointer. So this red line here are high needs districts, okay, high disadvantaged districts. So we're going to think of this in sort of medical terms. They're going to get a large dose from LCFF. Okay, and then the blue line are less disadvantaged districts, and they're going to get a lower dose. And all I want you to take away from this is before LCFF, which is at the 0 point here, once we control for the things in our model, you can't tell anything about the year-to-year change in revenue that these districts get. They are not distinguishable from one another, okay? So knowing the district level disadvantage gives you no information about revenue changes pre-LCFF. And yet after LCFF, you see the dosage effect start to take on, okay? There's also an exposure effect, the length of time that you've been exposed to this. So in year 1, those differences start to show up a little more. In year 2, even greater. In year 3, it's even greater, right? The red line gets a sharp increase. High dosage districts get more revenue, okay? All right, so just a little bit more about this. Our data allows us to look mostly at 3 post-reform years. So we go back many years before LCFF, but we're looking at the end at 2015-16 so far. And it's about 90% funded. So we might expect an even greater dosage effect down, or exposure effect down the road, okay? So we're gonna use test score data. As all of you know, California changed its standardized testing regime concurrently with its finance regime. So we have STAR testing before LCFF and now Smarter Balance after LCFF. Okay, so you can't immediately compare those. They're not the same standardized tests. But California students have taken the National Assessment of Educational Progress along this same time period, and the NAEP doesn't change. So we're going to be able to analyze test score data by norming STAR and Smarter Balance to the NAEP. We know what a STAR test score means in NAEP terms, and we know what a Smarter Balance test score means in NAEP terms. And so it allows us to make this apples to apples comparison with test scores. So that's how we do that. High school graduation rates, that's self-evident. We're going to use the 4-year cohort graduation rate. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there was recently a big report out sort of doubting the veracity of some districts and schools' graduation rates. So just to sort of account for this new uncertainty, we do this analysis with and without LAUSD in there, which was unfortunately the focus of this report. And we also do it with and without highly disadvantaged schools that might have more of a problem getting their cohort graduation rate data in line. And we qualitatively see the same thing when we do it all of these ways, okay? So we think we have a pretty robust graduation rate data set. Okay? All right, here we go. We're going to exclude charter schools and other non-traditional schools. The impact of LCFF on charter school performance is interesting. There's reasons to think they would respond to the policy somewhat differently. So for this analysis, we're just focusing on traditional K through 12 schools, brick and mortar. Okay, so here we go. So overall, these are grad rate results. We see a 5 percentage point gain in grad rates for each $1,000 extra per pupil that was received due to LCFF. That effect is slightly larger for students from low-income families, and then you can see the race and ethnicity distribution of the effect. I don't want you to make too much of the differences there. What I want you to do is to appreciate that this sort of rising tide has lifted all boats. Okay, the money matters for graduation rates, and it matters across the board. Okay? And just to give you more visual evidence that we're really isolating the effect of the revenue and not some other thing, I'm going to show you this graph at the top is the one I showed you before. It's the revenue increases. And it just looks the same as the graduation rate graph down here. Okay, grad rate is the y-axis here. And it just shows you that we can't tell anything about changing graduation rates once we control for the things in our model pre-LCFF. After LCFF, there's the dosage and exposure effect, just like we would expect. Okay? So let's move on to test scores. Okay, here we go. So the blue bars are for 11th grade mathematics. Overall is the shorter bar here. It's a meaningful effect, but we can't distinguish it from 0, right? So the Statistics 101, think back to that class that you all hated, we actually have to say that we can't find an effect for all kids in 11th grade math yet, okay? But for children from low-income families, it's markedly greater and statistically significant, okay? We can say there's an effect there. Now, 1906 standard deviations is not inherently meaningful to most people. So let me just give you a few ways to think about this in terms of benchmarks. It's approximately 7 months of learning, okay? People like to sort of benchmark gains in standard deviations by months of learning. I'm not a huge fan of that, but nevertheless, it's about 7 months of learning. Another way to think about the size of this blue bar is it's enough to cut the black-white test gap by 1/3. So I think that's actually quite large, okay? So now let's think about the reading effects. So those are the red bars there. They're both statistically significant, okay? They're a little smaller. It would be enough to cut the black-white test gap by about 1/10, or about 2.5, 3 months of learning, okay? In these big policy changes, we typically, though not always, find a greater effect on math than reading. So I think the fact that, this is playing out here. So I'm not disappointed myself by the impact on reading. I think that's pretty still meaningful and significant. But we do see a larger impact for math, okay? And then just to hit you over the head with it, this is the test score graph, and this is the finance graph that you've seen before. Same thing. Once we control for things, we can't tell anything about student performance pre-LCFF, and then the effects kick in, okay? Okay, so what I want you to take away is I think this is remarkable success after only 3 years. What we're going to remember about LCFF, of course, all of you know it like the back of your hands, but it's targeted to students. It's an increase in freedom, and we see these effects. And it's strange to have to keep repeating this. Paper after paper after paper keeps showing it, but money matters. And here it matters across demographic groups and across high school indicators of success, graduation rate and 11th grade test scores, okay? So of course, this doesn't close the book on LCFF. There will be much more research done. And some of the potential future work is, what role does this discretion play? This seems to be the issue of how much freedom we can give schools and districts to target the money, okay? We are definitely going to look at earlier grades, and then in the years to come, we'll have a longer exposure rate to see sort of what are the long-term impacts of LCFF. And with that, I'll open it up. Thank you.